Welcome to the HMG Podcast. I'm Daniel.
I'm Tyler.
I'm Jacob.
And today we're going to be deep diving into the beginnings of list building. Now, I say the beginnings of list building because a lot of the time people go straight into take this unit, get started with this on this force. There's actually a step that goes before that, and especially if you're new to bolt action, if you're new to wargames in general, it sort of starts with what is a list? And so we really want to cover those aspects there. So Tyler's probably got some questions as I go through this as a newer player.
I'll be basically you guys if you haven't played war games before, because that's basically where I'm at right now.
Yeah, so if you want to kind of rank positioning on where we would be within playing bolt action, we've kind of got newcomer, intermediate, and hardcore war games.
I have been known to play a lot of games. And so really for new players then, or gamers and hobbyists in general, when we refer to a list, and what we actually mean by a list is that's what you comprise your force of. That is what you would bring to a table to play a game. It's what the miniatures you would actually physically own or borrow in order to play and facilitate the game. And the list is a bit of paper that you then write that all down on, and generally, depending on the game system, they'll have points, they'll have other information you need to note down. But that's what we actually mean when we say a list. It's just worth getting that out of the way early.
So to put that in any kind of reference, if you're absolutely brand new to wargame and what we're talking about list, Dan mentioned a point cost.
Yeah.
To make a good comparison would be a real-time strategy video game. You are spending resources in the game to comprise of your army.
That's right.
So in bolt action, typically you're given either 1,000 points, 1,250, something like that both players will typically have the same amount of points level, and then they can buy an infantry squad for say 100 points, a tank for 250, and these kind of things. So you have to look at all of the various options within your nation, and you can pick and choose for the most part what you need, based on this is how many points it costs to actually purchase that unit.
Yeah, and so once you know, so now we all know what a list is in that very generic term. When you start getting into list building for an event or playing for a game, there are several questions, even at the basic and beginning element of list building, that if you understand what these are, it's going to help you build lists more efficiently. Not give you winning lists. We can't guarantee they're going to be winning lists, but these are lists that these are things that are going to help you actually construct a list and know what you need to be looking for. I think it's going to be maybe 3 episodes long in total, but we'll cover the basics today. And the first thing you need to do is, why are you creating a list? So Jacob, if I was to ask you, why would you create a list? What would your response be?
So it really depends on what your goal is for the game that you're going to have. I mean, typically, if you ask me 9 times out of 10, why are you making a list? I am making something thematic. I'm making something that could be historic, or I'm making something that's just damn cool. That's really the things that I look for. There are different players out there that really I want a hard-hitting list that does X. And that could be that, it has a lot of armor, it's very mobile, it has a lot of infantry. There's 10 different avenues you could have of list building itself and the kind of thing that you're working towards. For me, I pick things that interest me within the history. I look at the battles, I look at the movies I like, and I go, these are things I want to recreate and have fun with. That's my primary driving force. Completely different. It depends where you're at.
I'm very much a thematic, but once again, with each of these topics is so broad. I'm sitting here thematic, and my theme, if you've watched last episode,
which you should,
is pink. Yeah. That's the thing. The theme is pink. I had this thing I wanted to do, and I wanted to do it in a way that I felt comfortable doing. Pink's the way to go. It wasn't Band of Brothers, what a cool idea. Although I definitely want to make that at one point. But even within theme, it can just be you know what? I really like the cut of that guy's jib. I'm going to get him in and just build everything around him. That's how I got started with mine, because I got Captain K. I was saying last week from Jojo Rabbit. Mm-hmm. So it's crazy how...
And then at the other side, we're all going to be attending an event very, very shortly, and you might be designing your list around the actual missions that are being played, the side objectives that we have within
Yes.
the Skulls event.
Yes.
And then, maybe even to the level of this is what I feel my local meta is like, how can I counter that, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. They're all fantastic examples, and that outlines the two main views of why people create lists, which is a theme or a narrative slant where they're potentially building for a scenario to drive, or an event or a tournament where it's mission focused, or you are looking to be a little bit more, I guess, competitive is a word that was used quite frequently. There's also, specifically if you're recreating a battle, you might be building a list specifically to recreate the elements that we're fighting within that battle. So one of the ones that has happened quite frequently is recreating a D-Day fight. Like I think it was last year or the year before, where Warlord did their big promotion around the D-Day anniversary. But there is actually one other probably underdog of list building, and that's what I would call a generic all-rounder list. And you're not actually building that because of any particular reason. You're building that because you want to play a game. You're actually it's your pick up and play list where I've got several of them for my different forces where I go, if someone's just coming for a game, or if I'm wanting to teach someone how to play, there are certain things that I'll just include automatically in my generic list so I can work through those mechanics with them, but they're generally very balanced, very flexible to be able to do that. And it sort of doesn't, it's thematic because it's historic in reality, but it's not actually a historically based list, and it's certainly not an event min-max list or a competitive list or anything like that.
I think most lists become that because you start with something, you have this idea in mind, and then once you've built the list, you're like, that's good, and then you're like, I also like that and that toy and that toy. So you get more. I think you have that generic, but I think starting with that theme narrative is a really good way to get people involved.
100%. I mean, I think we've said it before on this podcast, but anyone that's involved in scale modeling, or anyone that's involved in historical wargaming, or even the sci-fi stuff and the other different channels, the aesthetic is a huge part of why people get involved. And it's not surprising that most people, when they think about, I want to build an army, most people will go, I want to build an army that actually represents X, Y, Z, whatever that be. So that's the first thing. You need to understand, why are you creating a list? The next part of list building as a generic guide that you need to be aware of is, what are the parameters that are either set for you or that you're going to set yourself. These are essentially the rules of do's and don'ts when you're actually building your list. Some of them are by social convention, so you don't normally want to see, I guess in a generic list, let's say 5 flamer profiles backed up by 2 multi-launchers.
Did someone say Polish cavalry?
Yeah, well, that we should clarify, we don't disagree with any of those lists, and we actually heartily support you play the game to have fun for you, and if that means that you do something like that, that's fine, that's not a problem. But in terms of parameters being set, we're talking more about, how many platoons do you want to put in your list? What do you actually want to represent? How many points are you building your list to? How many points are you given? Whether you're using a dice cap or not. And it also depends, as you touched on.
So just quickly, what's a dice cap?
Dice cap.
Playing at home.
Yes, thank you, Tyler. So generally, every unit will have its own order dice that goes into your total dice for the list. A dice cap, as it's colloquially known, is essentially a limit put on by generally an event organizer, or occasionally by agreement by players, where the number of units can't exceed that dice cap. There are actually several different takes on what that means. For example, it may simply be, you can't take any number of units above that amount. So if it's 12, you can have a maximum of 12 units. I've seen one of the other classic ones is, it's 12, but if your army or faction allows you to have extra units, like the Romanians or the Soviets, you can have that unit as a bonus because it's part of the rules, and both are valid. I've also seen and tried, if the unit cap is 12, you can include as many units as you want that you have points for, only 12 ever get to activate, which is a different spin. Really cool. Yeah, it's another level of complex play, because you essentially are forcing yourself, take as much as you want as you can fit, but you're only allowed to activate this many units. which means you are guaranteed to have units that don't do anything at all. But interestingly enough, that actually can give you a little bit more flexibility on the battlefield. Very different type of game. Make sure you and your opponent are aware of what you're doing when you do that one. And then the other one after the parameters there is your local meta. So the local meta is extremely subjective. If you can, even in Perth, we have a really good meta, but even in Perth, you can travel from one group to another. They might only be 10, 15 Ks apart, and their recognised, group rules and the way that they would build lists is very, very different. And so if you are playing in a local group and you're not sure something is either too powerful or maybe the other side where it's too underpowered, where you haven't got enough teeth in your list, don't be afraid to actually talk to people about it, because oftentimes, the times that I've had where I've gone, I'll just bring something that is like this, and it's either been ridiculously underpowered for what I was going in for, or it's been the other way where I'm like, that list was actually probably a little bit too tough for the game that we wanted. So you do need to just be aware about that. It's more of an informal parameter as opposed to a strict rule, but it's something that you should consider.
I think also talking to other people is a great way of finding out. I'm walking into this tournament and I have had no idea how to build my list, right? I was here because I liked the colour pink for this particular list. I wanted Pink Panther in there, and I wanted a squad of 10 AR toting badasses, right? That was my only parameters that I had. And then I'm sitting here looking at this list for, this empty list for skulls. And I was like, I don't know who to talk to. And I just posted on the Bolt Action Perth group, and Calder Jackson, shout out to Calder. Man, he knows his stuff.
He did your solid.
I was like, oh, thank you. He made my list for me because I had no kind of interest at that moment in time in learning how to do it. And so, he made the list, and I was like, oh, thanks, man. I know we're probably the enemy. He's like, no, I'm taking such and such. I'm not going to reveal this list, but people should be scared. That's basically it. I kind of looked at it, and he told me how he's going to operate it. I was like, oh damn, I'm glad we're on the same side. But that could be just because I'm a new player. But from what I've found, and this is just a general rule, I think most bolt action people are very friendly. And they want, we want new people to come play games with us.
For sure.
Yeah, so I think definitely talking and Facebook groups and everything is a great thing.
So the next thing then so you've got your parameters that you're building to, you've got why you're creating a list, you know what a list is. The next thing are what are your core requirements. And this one takes a little bit longer just to explain, because most of the time it will simply be an HQ choice, which is a junior or senior officer to lead your force. It can also be a major or a captain. I think there's even a couple of other forces which have specific leader type roles that can fill that. And then 2 troops choices, or 2 infantry squads, as Bolt Action calls them. Now most of that is driven from a roughly historic point of view, where you would have someone in command and then a section or 2 sections or 3 sections, depending on which nationality you're looking at, as a battlefield unit, and that's the scale that Bolt Action works at. It used to be that simple. Not to scare you, Tyler. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. I simply mean that we all generally had a reinforced platoon out of the rule book, and the theatre selectors, which I'll touch on in a moment, were generally all coming out of the army books, which adhered to the same format. Tank War was released. So we have tank platoons, which is 3 armour fighter vehicles or more. And there's slightly different composition rules around those.
Typically you need a command vehicle, which might not necessarily be a tank itself. It could be a half track that has an antenna on it or something like that. Just before we go on, when we're talking about the 2 troops choices for generic platoon, if you haven't really got into bolt action, depending on your nation, that can be about 10 different infantry choices. It could be 20, it could be 30, probably 30 is too extreme, but whatever. There's plenty of options that you can pick. and that can range from inexperienced troops to regulars to veterans and all kinds of things. So there's a lot of variation within the generic choices that you're required to take.
Yes.
You can go all out. You can have double LMG squads. You can have SMG squads in there. You can have just riflemen and all that. So there's even though it's almost mandated that this is for the majority of your list, you're going to need this. There's a lot of variation between every other player's list and how that looks.
And how the models look themselves. Like, I can't believe how many different companies there are online that sell World War II models. And
at different scales, right? Like, it's not even just a 28.
No, it's crazy. And like, I'm sitting there, and I have played war games in the past, 40k, which is, that there is only one kind of place you can get those models. And if you have anything else, they're not tournament legal. Like, people kind of don't like to see them on the table. You can't really play with them in the game store, stuff like that. So coming into this, and it's just so open. It's literally like the Wild West of, hey, you want your guys to look like that? You can make them look like that.
So what else we got? So we got the generic platoons that have the 2 troop requirements in the HQ. We got tank platoons that have a command vehicle and typically 2 tanks as well for starters. What else is there?
And then I think it was in either the Western Desert book or it might have been in the Battle for France book. And it's in one of the campaign books. I do own it. I just haven't remembered to note this part down. There's an anti-tank gun, a reinforced anti-tank gun platoon. So this is generic, available to all nations, and that actually comprises of an HQ and 2 anti-tank guns.
Perfect.
And I think from memory, it actually allows you to take up to 3 in one selector.
And with an anti-tank slot
with
as
an
well.
anti-tank slot on top. So
perfect.
And so it really is. You start really for those scenario-driven games where you're wanting to go, okay, we're going to have, for example, an armored column walk into an ambush that's been set, and so you might have an anti-tank gun ambush that's set up in a valley or whatever, where these armored columns going to come through. You can actually recreate that a little bit more easier, but you can actually take that as a list when those things are available. So and I think there's a couple of other. There's armoured company, I think, selectors, which are slightly different to tank platoon ones. I think the LRDG is one of those, and the Order Saharina Italian list, where they utilise, whilst it functions a little bit like a tank platoon, they're more the reconnaissance squad. So they're lightly armoured trucks with guns on the back and porties and stuff. So again, slightly different configuration. What you will notice is that you need someone to be in charge, and generally they have to be in charge of a minimum of 2 units within these cylinders. So that's really your core requirement. Depending on which way you go, you're going to need someone in charge, and you're going to need 2 units that support and do what they're told basically by the guy in charge.
So when it gets to theatre selectors, there's actually a lot of different options that you wouldn't traditionally get in a generic list. So we talked about a generic list would comprise of 2 infantry squads and an HQ at a minimum, and then typically you have additional slots in there that you can take. If it's not infantry, probably 1 off. So you could have 1 machine gun, you could have 1 flamethrower, you could have 1 tank, 1 armoured car. When you get into the theatre selectors, they really change that up to a level that would more be in a narrative concept. So New Guinea is a great example. So you would have a lot of fighting within the jungle that would actually parallel very similar to Vietnam later on, where it's all about ambushes. So there are lists that the Japanese can have 3 snipers instead of just 1, but the thing is they can't take any heavy equipment because they never had any. Right? Or in that particular part of the world at that point in time that they're invading jungles and whatever, they didn't have any heavy guns or tanks with them and that kind of stuff. So the theatre selectors are really interesting that you can take a different approach to what would be typically in the list. Those are the types that are out there.
Just out of curiosity, because we did run the last Skulls tournament. I was there taking pictures. I wasn't playing, but you allowed theatre selectors, right?
Yes, we did.
How many people? Just out of curiosity, how many people chose theatre selectors? How many were just generic reinforced platoons?
Off the top of my head, I think we were split about 50-50 down the middle. What was interesting though is of the people that built a theatre selector in order to either access a particular unit type or a particular set of rules or combination of units with rules, of the people that did that, most of the structure of how they actually built their list was a generic reinforced platoon. Like it followed the same
thing.
followed the same rules, which kept it a little bit closer overall.
And so I took a theatre selector, and I was really going through all of the Western Desert theatre selectors. I even opened it up to a point where I had 4 or 5 lists and let people vote for it.
Yeah, that's right.
But with that, the restrictions are heavy.
Yes.
So, we talk about just the Japanese with the 3 snipers or whatever.
Yeah.
Desert German lists don't have Panzerfaust. They also have their infantry squads are limited to what was in that conflict.
Yes.
So you can't get Waffen squads. You can only get the generic Heer infantry or the Schützen squads. And Schützen is also something that's like a little bit contentious. People think it's strong. People think it's kind of mediocre. It's this weird balance of... And I found, in the end, I took regular infantry because I wanted more bodies. They can only have 8 troops maximum in a squad.
Yeah.
So with theatre, there's positives and negatives to doing what you want to do.
Yeah. It's you're generally with the theatre selectors there is a drawback. They're all most, if not all of them, are time sensitive. So, like Jacob was saying, there's just certain equipment that, like 1942 or earlier, the Panzerfaust was still in development. It wasn't actually released, it wasn't distributed, and it certainly didn't make it to Western Desert. By that time it was all essentially all over at that part. But you have other, even just this, the vehicle types, the weapon loadouts. So the Soviets are a really good example. When you take a Soviet list prior to, I think it's 1943, might even be 1942. You can't double stack your LMGs in your squad. So even the squads that are dedicated light machine gun squads, their ammo shortages were their munitions shortages were so bad, and actually physically getting the weapons on paper, squads had 2. In real life, squads might have 1. Because Germany had almost reached Moscow and pillaged, and the production capacity wasn't there. And what the Red Army went through, I think it was 3 major reshifts in how they structured the overall, divisional levels to try and reallocate these resources. And that meant that you had squads running around. Whilst it may not have been as severe as you have ammo, you have gun. I don't know of any current record where it was that severe. Certainly units ran out of ammo and stuff, but I think every man still had close to it, still had a rifle or access to a rifle. But definitely with the machine guns and some of the support weapons and things like that, whilst the Soviet Union was recovering, it was there on paper, but it wasn't there in real life. The theatre selectors actually reflect that. You just simply can't take the second one. And that's not just for the first 2 squads. It's for any infantry squad that you add in. You just can't take it. Which makes it quite interesting on how they work. But you choose that because generally you get some sort of a benefit.
When it comes to events, typically you will be dictated on what you can and can't take. So it's not uncommon to see theatre selectors being not an option and generic being the standard. And maybe some events might have...
I'd just say for Perth.
By design, and I think it's a really smart choice. And then the other side to it is how many platoons do you allow in a list as well? Because you could really min-max if you were absolutely adamant on a particular selection within one list to go with multiple platoons, so you can get 2 bazookas or whatever it is that you're really hunting for.
It's also the number of platoons that you play at the number of points level is often a bit of a slippery slope, because unless a player is deliberately going to abuse it, there's nothing inherently wrong with doing that in the way that you build your list by taking multiple platoons within the points level. From a pure rules as written point of view, You can do it. You could put 3 platoons in 1,000 points if you really wanted to. I'd argue there's maybe not as much benefit to do that necessarily because you've got to pay for those officers still that fit those HQ slots, and you have to take the infantry that goes with it. One option is making them smaller squads so you can fit that stuff in. But the reality is that once you've got multiple platoons, certain other things become available. So America dual platoon lists at 1,000 points were notorious in version 1 because you would end up with multiple machine gun jeeps running around. You would have multiple air observers, which of course American air observers got double airstrikes. So I have played games against, which I still had fun. I didn't win them all, but I still had fun. I've had multiple games against that dual airstrike list, and it's actually a quad airstrike list. And it's pretty dangerous at times. You know, it can, especially at 1,000 points, that can be quite challenging to deal with. But there are ways to deal with it, and it's about learning how to play. But that's starting at the slippery slope. There's also, and I should say, we are not calling out anyone that plays in this way. Like again, it's all equally valid ways to play, and I enjoy playing the game, so it's not a problem there. Another one is the Soviet Silo Heights selector. That allows you to have 2 tank slots. Now it's a late war selector with 2 tank slots, which means you've got access to generally some of the better tanks. So you could almost, in 1,000 points, run 2 of those with 2 fairly decent tanks in each selector. So even though you're not running an armoured platoon, you could almost have 4 tanks on the table.
Right.
That's a lot of points to do that. It's a lot of points to do that. But you can almost do it because if you just take, if you essentially take 3 rifle squads, then it makes it quite simple.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to the purpose of creating lists, and we're going to list a couple archetypes of what a list might entail and your kind of decision or process or purpose of where you're heading in the sort of that list. So the very beginning, we'll probably talk about what we call balance, which is the generic platoon kind of mentality where you're taking an all-comers list that can typically handle any sort of scenario, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's probably where I design most of my things, because it's not the wrong answer in any situation. And there's a lot of tactical flexibility with not locking yourself into it and into these other archetypes that we're going to be talking about. So run through a balanced list, Dan.
Yeah, so I 100% agree with what you're saying there, Jacob. And especially for anyone that's learning or is new to the game systems, to build a balanced list first and get a hang of how that all plays out and works is a much better approach. You can do some of these other ones, but it takes a little bit more effort because the learning curve's a little bit steeper. So with a balanced list, you're adequately able to either defend or attack. That's really, in a nutshell, that's as simple as it is. You are either able to, if you need to get to an objective, you advance and you can support that objective, not just with the unit that's there, but with the rest of your list. You can support an attacking advance. Alternatively, if your opponent looks really scary or has a multi-launcher, you can defend. And that might mean, spreading out to minimize your impact, trying to get out of line of sight, trying to force your opponent to come to you so that you can deal with them on your terms. A balanced list can do either of those, and it will do either of those just as well as each other. So there's no forte or primary objective out of that. It's simply, I need to defend on my right flank, I need to attack on my left flank, and so I'm going to sort of try and sweep this way and anchor it in. So a balanced list will have a little bit of everything that we're about to talk about throughout the rest of these types.
So typically, when I think of balanced lists, when it comes to construction of it, I need things that can handle armor. I need lots of infantry options that can handle infantry, and I might put in some artillery pieces as well. So I look at mostly all of the unit slots that you can have and see what's best I can fit within the dice cap, within the points limit, that's all going to complement each other rather than really anchoring in on this is the focus of the list in the sense of everything's anti-infantry.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
Yeah.
I think other host of the show, Gorchard, puts it best.
Yeah.
He says he wants a toolbox.
That's right.
That's what I think
Yeah,
when I think
100%.
balance. I'm like, you're able to do everything. Like, if you lose one part, you're not like, damn, I'm lost. Like, I've actually, like, I can't make this list work anymore. It's like, he's just like, I have a tool for every single job. And he also says, if I'm hammering in a nail, I don't necessarily need a hammer, I just need a wrench. Like, so it doesn't have to be the right unit for the right job. Like, exactly, but as long as
it's having something there that you can use.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that's important about a balanced list, you generally will find that a good balanced list will have, I'd say, anywhere between 3 to 4 squads worth of infantry, and probably, you know, the 8 to 10 man squads worth of infantry, because bolt action is an infantry game, and if you have a good core of infantry within your list, you will generally find that you can defend or attack or hold an objective or put pressure on an opponent. So yeah, just have a think about that. The type of infantry starts to matter a bit more, and how you equip them matters a bit more with the archetypes. But in a balanced list, you probably want 3 to 4 actual units worth of bodies and guys with rifles.
And I think it's really important when you are designing a list to actually look at this purpose just a little bit closer, in the sense that, okay, if I'm typically going for mostly a balanced list, then, you know, these other ideas that I might have in my head that are pushing it out of that scope might not be the best idea. In particular, when your mentality is, this is the way that I want to play, and then I have this little side asset that's just not in line with the thinking and the mentality of the entire list itself. Yep. So people can get really sidetracked on things that are, you know, very cool in a sense. So, you know, I absolutely want a tiger in this list. Does that make it balanced? Maybe it doesn't. It really, you have to tweak around it to make it work. Yeah. But, you know, if you have an aggressive element within your list, is it now balanced? Is it now aggressive? And if you are going for an aggressive element, maybe the list should be aggressive entirely, and you should really focus on that element of the list itself, and that's the mentality of the game, instead of just picking and choosing one game mentality and another and trying to work them in unison.
Don't tell me that now. I've got a panther in there, and then I've also got a squad of...
I've played plenty of events with a panther, and pretty good.
Like, my whole list is defensive except this one squad of ARs.
I did tell Tyler when he was coming over to help with this particular episode, I was like, just be aware, I'm probably going to melt your brain as I talk about some of this stuff, because he's just tried to figure out how to play, and I'm going to ruin it.
I don't know if I articulated it quite well enough. Like, having one aggressive element is good. Having an AR squad in a transport or something is very good, because it has a job and a duty. Yeah. But as soon as you start doubling down to 2 or 3, and then it's... I know you have 2 AR squads.
Flamethrower too.
That's alright.
It's alright, we'll get to it. This is probably actually a really good segue to move off of balance, and we'll actually talk about an aggressive list, right?
Sure.
Now, we briefly covered aggressive list before on one of the previous episodes when we were talking about deployment, but largely an aggressive list, the purpose of that list is to take the fight to your opponent and to keep up a very high level of pressure so that you can try and force mistakes that your opponent makes and then exploit those opportunities. So, you know, a really good aggressive list would be something like Waffen SS with assault rifles. By default, assault rifles are good. They're just good. I know some people don't want to think they're good, but they're actually really good.
Yeah.
The ability to take the assault rifles and, you know, put them within a truck, or just be aggressive in how you position those, you are generally going to outperform rifles. They're generally on veteran infantry. You can put the pressure up, and you can take quite a bit of damage and force your opponent to have to deal with the unit that you're putting in front of them. That's what we mean by aggressive. It's about putting. It's not about my tank's really aggressive. Running it forward. You don't necessarily want to put your tank in a vulnerable position. It starts being less aggressive and starts being bait. But an aggressive list, and aggressive units within that list are designed when you use them on the table, specifically by design, to force your opponent to react to them and to put the pressure on and to be advancing and pushing on that defensive line to try and break it. And then as soon as you have, say, crumbled 1 or 2 units, either from a heavy howitzer hit or the tank's got up and just machine gun something to death, and a hole's been created, the next part of the aggressive list that really caps it off is you have to exploit that. You have to exploit the fact that you've now created a gap in their line, and you actually have to push that resource and really drive the wedge in. And it's quite, when done well, it's actually quite effective because your opponent suddenly goes, I've literally just lost my left flank, I can't leverage it back because I can't deal with the thing that just attacked me. So if your assault rifle unit gets in and decimates an infantry unit, even though they've shot for this turn, for someone to take on an assault rifle unit, they've got to have certain tools in the kit. If they're only shooting back at you with rifles, you're going to win that fight. You're just going to win the fight.
I mean, we know how well a veteran fanatic assault rifle squad does against a squad. Like, anecdotally, I put them right on the flank of your paratrooper force in the last event playing, and they just didn't move after they killed something, forced you to change your game plan and everything. So I can definitely see the purpose of having aggressive units. It just completely changes the rhythm and cadence of people's thoughts, because you have to now deal with this problem that's placed right in front of you.
That's right.
I would almost look at it from another, going back to the video game analogy, that this is now map control.
Yes.
And that might not necessarily play in with the objectives that are on the actual game board itself, but that's dictating what they're doing elsewhere.
Absolutely.
So it's something to think about, that now your strong squad is there on that flank, and maybe it's not necessarily doing anything in the immediate for that side of the board. It's dictating things that are happening elsewhere.
Yeah. Howitzers using direct fire and ambush are actually extremely aggressive. If you've ever fought against someone doing that, it's because they don't use the indirect fire for the sits. They're going, no, if you move out into a spot that I can see you, I'm going to use the direct fire option and I'm just going to blast you. And so when you start realizing and putting things together, that's they can choose the point at which they want to trigger ambush. I can't get inside their minimum range, but that's irrelevant because they're firing direct. Now, if I'm lucky, I might get hit on 4s for the range modifier. I'm no one wants to get hit with a howitzer on 4. That's the worst thing that could possibly happen.
Trouble.
Yeah, it's not good. So we might just move on.
So how about we just list what we have?
We've got 2 minutes left.
Right.
So
we'll
cut this piece out.
Yes, we'll cut it out.
So we might just move through and we'll just list off the other ones quickly before we get into them. So there's obviously the opposite of aggressive, which is a defensive list. So we'll go into that. Then there's also what's known as the span bodies or the high body count. It's known by many different names, but essentially lots of infantry models on the table. There's a mobility purpose, and the entire drive around that is that your force is more maneuverable, and we'll get into that in a moment. There's also high resistance, and so that's all about how much damage can you actually negate simply by being tough. And there's a few very key elements that make a high resistance list. And then the last overall purpose of the list is leveraging out specific special rules attached to units or theatre selectors or nations in order to make a very honed and dangerous force.
What's the just here behind the scenes, we have an episode sheet of what we're talking about, and Dan has written here Army rules like British rifle training.
Yeah, I wrote British rifle training because I couldn't remember what it was called.
This is where you're
shooting
rapid fire.
That's the one. Thank you. So rapid fire, which is where your rifleman, for every 3 rifles, you get an extra shot. And so in the infantry squads that the British run, when you're using that trait, one of the 4 that are choosable, your rifle squads actually put out a significant amount of firepower. It's actually better when you double down on that and you take multiple sections that all suddenly you're putting out what equivalently, I think it works out to, so a group of 12 gets you an extra 3 shots. So you're almost getting a light machine gun at that point. But when you're multiplying those squads, but they're all shooting towards the same target, those extra shots almost is a whole other unit.
This is actually a military doctrine within the British Army that starts within World War One. They call the tactic rapid fire.
It's like the mad minute or something.
How many shots they were drilled to be able to cycle the guns and fire at a faster rate with their bolt action rifles. So we're looking to cover those types, and we just covered aggressive. Now we're going to go and have a look at defensive. So a defensive list is designed to have the opponent come to you and then break upon the defense that you've set up. And then you then meet whatever push they provide with your committed reserve. Now, there's a couple of technical things that I've rattled off, but when I talk about a dedicated reserve or your reserve that you're holding forward that's going to meet with the push, that means you need to have a unit of infantry or something that you have deliberately not put in the front line. So if you drew an imaginary line on the battlefield of where your deployment is and you've got your units across that line, you actually want one a little bit further back. It doesn't necessarily matter where it is. Central is generally better, but you need a unit deployed a little bit further back so that whichever way the enemy or your opponent, rather than enemy, your opponent puts their pressure, puts their force, and makes a move where they go, you can see they move their units and you go, they're going to attack me in the center, or they're going to attack me on the left, or they're going to attack me on the right. Just break it down really simply to that. Your dedicated reserve unit needs to go to that spot. They need to go into that side of the plane, because otherwise what's going to happen is they're potentially going to get to that, they will hit your force, they'll potentially break the units, and they'll exploit it, just like the aggressive list we were talking about.
So when it comes to bolt action, Dan was just talking about reserve in the sense of actually having figures on the table that were kind of in your backlines and then manipulating and moving to where they need to be.
Yes.
However, you can also, in the game of bolt action, opt to have troops in reserve which are off table.
Yes.
And outflank as well, which both could really sit into this defensive strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And ironically, the outflank also with the aggressive can work as well, because you're deliberately bringing something in on the side. And we talked about those 2 particular mechanics within our deployment episode that we did. We covered those quite well. But absolutely, for a defensive, the ability to have something safe off board and then bring that on at the spot where you need it to meet the enemy's push, I cannot understate how important that is for certain mission types.
That can be quite important.
Critical.
Depending on the actual scenario, but in a lot of instances where you have an attacker versus defender scenario,
absolutely.
There is typically a prep bombardment on the defensive position. There's pros and cons to having stuff on board and off, but typically one of the first things that a new player will do, either in a balanced list or in a defensive list, is they'll tend to keep their armor in reserve. And that's so it can react when the enemy armor has already activated, moved on the board, got into a position that it can be fired upon. That seems to be the first lesson most people learn when they start playing bolt action.
What's the deal with reserves? Like, does it have to have a reserve special rule, or can I literally go, I put these 3 units in reserve?
So I'll quickly summarize. The mission will tell you whether or not you can or cannot put something into reserve, or how much of your force. Most of the time it sits between 25 to 50%. And simply, if it says you may put units into reserve, you get full agency over deciding what goes into reserve. So you might sit there and you go, I definitely want my AR squad and my tank in this particular mission. I want those things in reserve so that I can bring them on later, either where they need to go or to react to my opponent who's done something, or if I see an opportunity that I'm like, nah, they just need to get on the board now. But they don't have to have a special rule about reserve. Any unit is technically eligible.
Cool.
There are some that I wouldn't recommend doing it for, and that's anything that doesn't have a toe, because it will be stuck there. You won't ever get it out of reserve.
When it comes to reserves, there are a handful of special units out there that do have benefits for a reserve.
Yeah.
So typically, you have your morale rating of the infantry, the vehicle, the unit that you're bringing on, and you have to make a morale roll at neg 1
At
to
neg
bring
one.
it off from
At neg 1.
Neg 1. So, sometimes you don't get the reserve that you want at the time that you need it, but typically it will come the next turn when you need it.
Yeah.
But
Or it'll come the turn after everything's dead.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But
Just in time.
when we're talking about reserves right here, the real big benefit of that in a defensive scenario is that you now have the deployment zone. So maybe it is the left flank that needs stuff or the right.
Yeah, as opposed
Yeah.
to them having to run across.
Yeah.
I got one more question on defensive.
Mm.
Might be a slight giveaway that I'm playing a defensive list.
As was that.
How do you get your opponent to come to you? Because
Yeah.
obviously that's the key to a defensive list working. Otherwise, they'll just be like, cool, I'm gonna sit back here and just.
Or what happens if you have a defensive list, for example, fight a defensive list? Yeah. Okay. So one of the other elements of a defensive list that you will generally have is some form of heavy weapon, be it a mortar, medium, heavy, whatever, or a howitzer, or both. So sitting back against a defensive list isn't always the best thing to do, because you can just get ranged in by HE shells. In order for, I guess, what you're talking about and force your opponent to come to you and have them engage, you almost do need to bait them a little bit. And so this goes into, I guess, more the tactics and mechanics of playing. You never want to run your units towards the opposition because you'll be caught out of position, but you do want to generally advance up 6, try and use cover and play towards the center, as in the center line of the table, it's not the center left to right, but up and down. Make movements towards the center to try and see what your opponent will commit, because you've got to remember bolt action happens 1 unit at a time, so it's very hard to say after the first turn that you've had your opponent come to you. At the end of turn 4, when 2 or 3 of their units have approached forward and have engaged with you, and you've been able to go, that's great, you've now moved into line of sight of my howitzer or whatever, and I can just nail that unit on a direct shot. That's what we're talking about. So it isn't just sitting there waiting, for example, like an Empire or Dwarf gun line from Warhammer Fantasy days, where you would just sit and you would go, I'm just going to shoot you, I don't care. It's not that level. It's you actually do still need to get a little bit of engagement, but what you're trying to do is actually pull the enemy units away from their support so that you can double down on them with 2 or 3 units and nail them with something.
So typically when it comes to attack and defender scenario, there's a lot of objectives that dictate the attacker to actually come to you. Typically they would score victory points being in your deployment zone. But there's another way to sort of think about what kind of dice activations you would do to retain defensive. Like, is your goal to actually just sit there until turn 6 in the sense of survive the oncoming attack? So that might be that you do quite a bit of ambushing, and ambushing might not be firing, it might actually be going down.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So a defensive list is, so if you've set up in terrain, so you've got your cover modifier, and you know that your opponent, let's say you're playing point defense, your opponent has to run to the other end of the table, they've got 3 objectives they need to capture. You essentially, even after the prep bombardment goes down, you essentially can go in ambush and wait to then either go down if you're shot at, making your units ridiculously hard to hit, or you can open up with the fire orders at the end of the turn, or as they move out of cover. That would be one really good example. You're right, you generally only see a dedicated defensive list in a attacker-defender scenario, or if the selector that they've used is specifically set up for it. So the generic anti-tank gun platoon set up, that is 100% a defensive force, because you are setting up at least 3 fixed artillery pieces.
And on the same, you'll have lists that have multiple machine guns.
Yes.
You'll have lists that will have multiple snipers and these kind of things, and they might actually have the limitation that doesn't allow them to be aggressive. They might not have transports, they might not have tanks or something like that.
Okay. So that's probably covering off defensive quite well. So the next one, which I'm just going to go through, is the spam bodies, or the the body count. Again, there's a number of names that this goes through. Soviets and Japanese are particularly well known for this particular tactic. But the purpose of the list is you put as many bodies on the table as you can possibly afford within the points and restrictions. These don't necessarily have to be veterans or even regulars. You're looking at the inexperienced horde style army. It's lots of cheap units.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all it comes down to.
And my sort of feeling on this spam list, typically, not even having played it, but from reading things online, etc., it is about how much order dice advantage you can get.
Yes.
It is about not necessarily winning any sort of combat itself, but surviving those attacks.
Yes.
And then just really honing in on the actual numbers, in the sense that the goal's probably close combat.
Yeah.
And having those numbers can really
Make a
sway
difference.
which way that it's going to go.
Absolutely.
So there are a lot of things in there. So we talked about, Soviets are a great option for this. Japanese, the option that's publicized online quite a lot is the spearmen, who don't have the actual rifles themselves, but doubled with the bonsai rules and that kind of stuff is really cool. And then the other one I think is partisans as well.
Partisans, yep.
That you can effectively do it with anything.
You absolutely
Those are a little bit better or more
I'd
concentrated efforts for that kind of list.
Yeah, I'd say they have. They've got more complementary rules that go with them that make them particularly good. But you could also, a spam bodies. It could simply be regular troops, not even inexperienced troops, but I could take an entire US force with nothing but riflemen and reducing my special weapon count to nothing, so I don't have any special weapons in the squads, and instead I use that to purchase more riflemen. The entire force has movement and fire rule, right? And so every weapon that I put in of one of those that is also attached to a man puts the survivability of that list up quite significantly. But yeah, it's a very simplistic view of it, and you do have to be able to utilize the actual units themselves. But it's basically get as many bodies as you can. Don't buy things that aren't going to get you more bodies.
So this is a little bit outside of the archetype, but typically now I am actually filling squads quite high numbers. So typically before this sort of revelation, I've been going for lots of weapon teams within the infantry squad so that they can do the damage, but I always found that they were getting taken out.
Yes.
And I think that survivability is something that's quite important, and it can really come from not just the veteran stuff and not just these things that we're going to be talking about in the high resistance, but number of bodies is actually quite important.
Yeah, it absolutely is. That's spam bodies. The next one that we want to chat about is high resistance. This is an interesting one. So high resistance is all about maximizing your damage, resistance and capability within your force. Lots of veterans. The Soviet body armor that makes it harder. Gun shields on your AT guns and stuff. Using heavily armored vehicles, using I can't remember, but the side armor panels on the German vehicles to protect. It's points for investment in damage reduction.
Recce
even, it's an interesting one because it doesn't specifically make it harder to hurt. It makes it almost invincible. Because if you time it right, you can just get away. But it's thinking a little bit further about it. So it's veterans supported by a medic. So even when they do take damage, there's a very, very slim possibility that you might get it back. You might actually not lose it. Now, it infuriates people when a medic works. It infuriates them even more when a medic works on a veteran. Taking multiple 9 armor vehicles or possibly even multiple 10 armor vehicles. Taking 10 armor vehicles that have extra armor so they don't take the side or the rear penalties. All of those sorts of things that you're investing points to make it harder to deal damage to you. Now, what does that mean? That means that your units are very expensive. Very expensive. Your armored fighting vehicles especially are going to be on the top end of the scale in terms of points. And you may even have, because you're going with veteran infantry, you're also going to have potentially special rules attached to that, like stubborn or fanatic or any of those other ones that go on in their more specific senses. But those things, fanatic especially, is very good at damage resistance. And the sole reason is because the way that it plays out in the game is that unit's not dead until the last man is dead. In terms of damage resistance, you're really, because most people you'll go for the 50% mark of the damage, and then if you haven't got your 50% upright, then it's irrelevant. Once you reach 50%, you roll that morale check, and then they will either potentially fold or stay around. Fanatic just goes, no, I don't care about any of that. You have to kill me all, and so your enemy has to, your opponent, I keep saying enemy because the PC games we've been playing lately, but your opponent that you've played the game against, they have to invest more resources to make that unit go away. And that some of the Fanatic squads that I've played with before with my Soviets, that NKVD squads, they're brutal, absolutely brutal. They're only 12-man troops, and they're not, they're regulars, they're just Fanatic regulars, and my opponents are like, they would have folded normally there.
Because they paid the points.
Just paid the points, made it Fanatic. 3 points a model, definitely point heavy. But I truly think a worthwhile benefit if you're going for that as the purpose of your list. Combining that with a KV1 would just be yuck.
When we were talking about defensive, it's just a little sort of tactic that just hit my mind that would hit both defensive and high resistance. You were talking about drawing the enemy to you. Smoke might actually be a good variant to actually use within high resistance and within defensive for negating damage that's going to be done to your troops. So it's something to think about. Smoke is actually a very strong option. We've talked about it a few times before. It's just so difficult to make that decision and go, I'm not going to get a kill for this, but you might make a more sound decision that's going to have some more tactics for you. Yeah,
smoke's a tricky one. I personally really like it, and irrespective of what we think of how the rules actually work and things like that, or people doing house rules or whatever, I think that the reality is that smoke does have a benefit. It's just hard to pull off. But when it's pulled off, it feels good. It feels really good. It's one of those ones that's like, yes, great.
I could really see high resistance being sort of a flavour of what you would do, either in defensive or aggressive.
Yes.
It's not mandated in either of those. You can do spam in that if you wanted to.
Correct.
But those are probably sort of key aspects to either holding the line or having a really aggressive attachment in your force that they will do the job that they're designed to do. That toolbox analogy that Gordon brings up.
Yeah, that's right. And so the next one that we want to cover and have a look at is mobility. Now, mobility has a couple of different facets to it. The first is physically the models and how fast they are able to move around the table, being mobile. But there's also your ability to recce as a mobility option, and that's more about, if you stack a number of units together that are able to utilize recce, it becomes very hard to tie those units down because it's hard enough sometimes to tie one recce unit down. It's about repositioning, it's about hit and run tactics. So one of the other obviously classic ones would be a tank platoon, utilizing a mechanized infantry force, so you've got multiple trucks or half tracks with troops inside, and so you can put a set of 12, 15 rifles where you need it to go. Cavalry are a very classic one, the same as tank platoons, but for a different reason. Also come with the benefit of an escape move, and so do motorbikes.
And normal bikes.
And normal bikes, yeah.
Pretty good too.
So all of those different things leverage the mobility of the units and the list in a slightly different way, but it will make your list much more flexible in how it maneuvers around the battlefield. I can't tell you the number of times I've looked at, the battlefield that we're playing on. It might resemble something hypothetically out of Northern Europe, and there is hedges and walls everywhere, like just absolutely everywhere. And my infantry look at that and go, I am essentially going to move 36 inches this entire game, which is still a lot.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to be doing a lot of accurate shooting if I'm doing that.
Yeah.
But I can't run through a hedge. I can't run through a wall. I haven't tried that personally, but I'm not really game to.
No.
That's sensible.
Yeah. Whereas some of these other lists, like if I'd had a truck, if I'd had a half track for some of those troops, where I can then get over those walls, or I can move them quicker than what a run would potentially on a road. Or if I'd taken, I got a nice soft spot for motorbikes, where I'm sort of like, I'm tossing up some options on what I might do with another list. So, motorbikes at the moment are high on my priority list to figure out how to get the most out of. They also have an escape reaction like cavalry when you take the motorbike units themselves. But they're just, they're quite thematic, which is what's sort of drawing me towards them. But it's all about, how can you reposition to negate your opponent's cover, get closer, get further away. With some of these mobility options, once you essentially have taken a fire order or anything like that, you're forced to dismount, and so then you're an infantry unit at that point. So you've got to utilise the repositioning as best as possible. But when mobility is taken to its extremes, then you can start looking at things like Tom's complete Polish cavalry list that he did, which he did on the theme, sort of inspired by the charge of the Light Brigade. No guns. Well, sorry, I think he had 2 pistols and maybe an artillery piece. But essentially, it was all cavalry. His list was so incredibly fast because those cavalry run 18, and so he was able to very easily reposition. And if he was getting shot before he moved, he'd use their escape move and just disappear. So very, very good at outmaneuvering. And if you didn't know how to combat that, quite challenging to fight.
Another very quick one. So for Skulls coming up in 2 weeks, I'm taking allies kind of for the first time, and I was really kind of stuck on what kind of infantry squads I wanted to fit in. I've actually gone all Rangers. So Rangers are unique in the sense that you're paying an extra point a model, and that they have a free movement action before the game starts. So they essentially get a free run up the board 12 inches in any direction if you like. But they actually have some cool, interesting rules attached to that mobility when it comes to prep bombardment. And that is that you roll to see if they're affected by the prep bombardment, like does it happen to them at all? So on a 4+, I think they negate it, or it's the other way around. If they are hit with it, they get the normal effects, but they still do their free movement after the fact. So you can skip the bombardment at all because they're moving out of the deployment zone. So for 1 point, there's a 50-50 chance that they'll just skip bombardment altogether. If not, they'll still do their free movement, but they'll take the effects of the pins or maybe the casualties from the bombardment itself.
So you're paying 1 point a model extra for their special rule.
That's right.
So the way that it works out, so the US Rangers in and of themselves are a unit choice with that cost built in, and they get the rule attached to it. So you can't take Rangers without having that rule. But the reason you take Rangers is because of that rule.
So you could have like 1 unit of Rangers, say in just like a generic kind of platoon, and it'd just be that unit that could still like advance 12.
Advance 6.
They run 12.
They get the 12 run. So yes, they essentially get it's this free move, and it's been around since first edition when they came out.
That's kind of cool.
It's very cool. The range. I am surprised that I have not seen more American players running ranges in the WA scene.
I think I know what my next list is.
Yeah. So the problem with Rangers, as against what Goshen will say, is the default infantry selector for US is that it isn't the Marine squad, which has 3 bars and has a couple of more S&Ps and whatever else.
Yeah.
But when it comes to US, particularly with mobility, their move and shoot is really good to begin with. So rifles aren't a bad option for US. So my thought process going into this event is there's, I think it's clear the cache. Is that the objective? You got the 3 things. So I want to actually get those points secured and make that map control before things get too hectic.
You
so
that's
so I thought, another 10 points per squad, it wasn't really a big deal. And, seems like I think prep bombardment is in all of those missions bar 1, if that. So it might be a nice idea to actually not get bombarded.
Be able to avoid that.
Well, when you can sit there and you can go, right, cool, 50% of the time over the 3 rounds, which is that will round up to approximately twice if you were playing. If you're playing devil's advocate, maybe it's going down to 1. But either way, you're going to get at least 1 within one of them's not affected. You're potentially going to get 2 or 3 rounds where you'll actually get this time neither of them are affected.
I took it for the mobility, and I'm like, oh wait, it can do this too. So
it's really cool.
Yeah, it's like here's your chocolate and here's your sprinkles.
And your cake and eat it too.
Yeah. So the last one that we're going to look at is leveraging the special effects of rules. Now this one in particular it's quite short because the purpose it's more of a tack on to other things, but this is like using Mongolian cavalry in a Soviet list. Mongolian cavalry, they're the only cavalry in the game that I'm aware of that are able to fire their carbine rifles as rifles whilst mounted. That is not a thing.
Yeah.
Normally you can only fire them to shoot. If you fire them, you have to fire them as pistols, which normally means people don't bother and they just go straight into a combat. But these guys are like, no, we're trained, we can do it. We're just going to do it from horseback and we're going to use our rifles. I mean, you pay for it, right? It's with the points. But they are very, very cool. Yep. Very, very cool.
Another quick thought there would be obviously the Finnish special rules that allow them to do the advance into ambush.
Yes.
Yep. And then, other things like very standard is German. Why not just double down on a lot of GMGs, get that extra shot off?
That's right.
And we were talking a little bit earlier about the British training for rapid fire.
Yep. And it's also things like, maximising units that can go into forward deployment, maximising units that are able to, and when I say maximise, I mean take as many as you can, not necessarily as big as you can. But you end up with, like, I think the Chinese National Force has a really good way of getting multiple forward deployers of fairly large squads for cheap that you can just put down the board and set up. But it's things like that. So it's more of a tack on to the other purposes, but it can be a purpose in and of itself.
I think I did this accidentally because I took a German list. And, I didn't do it accidentally. Calder did it, and then I realised why he did it. Because I have, cat's out of the bag now, 2 squads of 6 with 2 LMGs in each. And he's like, use them together at all times where possible.
Yes.
And I was doing some counting, and I was like, that's like 32 shots is what it was, like with rifles and LMGs. 28 shots.
So on the same target as what he was.
He was like, just focus all that, and you'll be right. And I was thinking about it, like going through all this that we're learning and everything, putting it all into practice. I'm like, that makes sense. Like defensive list, a lot of LMGs, just plant them down, make the enemy come towards my LMG squads, where I then have my Panther and my AR to kind of back them up, and then if something gets in the way of my howitzer, Nelly, it's in trouble. It's interesting watching all this come together in my head, and I hope it's helping the viewers at home. I had another point,
Look,
but I can't.
it's a starting point. Like, you know, we have listed some ideas of all of these archetypes.
Absolutely.
There's a lot more to each of them, and we could go into a deep dive for a long time on all of them, and the list building, all that stuff. If you really want that, ask this guy. You know, put it in the comments or whatever else.
Yeah.
But you know, reading this list, I am now going to sit back and think about what I'm going to do for my next list. So I've used the word list twice, but the list of archetypes that we've used is how, you know, these are thought processes that will go into my future.
Absolutely.
List building for the game.
And quite a lot of these are very representative of what happens in other war games of this sort of scale as well. So, you know, I know things like Flames of War has their type of list breakdowns and purposes of those lists. They have a span body horde style. They have a aggressive tank lead. They have, you know, the span lists of other bits and pieces with those what are known as good units that you leverage to get across with their rules. The same in Games Workshop product games, and for years I played those, which is sort of where my understanding of a lot of this. I spent a lot of time thinking about how I think and thinking about how I build lists and talking to people about how we build lists to understand, you know, what do they think about when they do things and what does it look like, and then looking at military history and learning about that side and what did they actually do in the real world, what did they need to do in the real world, and what does that look like if I wanted to replicate that on the table.
One of the things I would have liked to have said before we started this purpose of the list is that I feel, and I've brought this up a couple of times on this cast before, that bolt action is really a game that can be consumed by a novice and enjoyed. Not understanding any of this, you can still play the game, and you won't be tabled because you don't understand these, or that, you know, you have a mobility list that is against a high resistance list. That doesn't necessarily dictate the flow of the game. My understanding that is actually a huge thing in other games where the game can be decided before dice are rolled. In bolt action, I feel that is at a minimal. It is something definitely to think about, and surely at the higher levels as well. But you don't have to do this to have a good time. And this has to do with the theme of the game.
Yes.
The fact that, you know, the statistics for an infantry model are pretty much the same across the board, bar what weapon options and maybe special rules that they have. And typically that you have a vehicle that has similar stats. You have medium tanks across the board with all nations. They all have slight variations, but you're never at a point where he has X, I can't do anything.
And you don't need to know everything. Like I was talking to someone last Outpost 6030. It was Gorchin's friend. He'd been wanting to play for a while, I think. He played a lot of Warhammer, and he came and played his first game in bolt action. And he was like, oh, it's great. Like, because I don't have to know the other person's codex. Like, flat out. Like, I don't need to know, you know, what that Slanesh demon does, or that Bloodthirster or Marine does.
Again, not that there's anything wrong with any of those games.
No.
We love playing some of those.
It just makes it really easy to consume. And
it does make it easy to consume. And now, one of bolt action's selling points always has been its simplicity, and so some of those things that you're talking about have been done specifically to make the game simpler to consume, but also to make it faster to play. So you know that a man with a rifle, it's a man with a rifle, he might be, you know, slightly more experienced, therefore harder to hurt, but the reality is that you look across the table, you see 10 guys in the unit with rifles, you go, that's a unit of 10 guys with a rifle. It's exactly the same sort of capability and vulnerability as my unit of 10 guys with a rifle. I can certainly appreciate how some people find that maybe a little bit boring or a little bit stale, but it's, from my point of view, it's actually been very refreshing just to be able to get on and play a game and not have to worry about too many intricacies. And I love intricacies, right? But to actually just play it and just get on with the game sometimes was the better outcome for me.
It kind of depends on what you want. Like, and this is going off topic a little bit,
Yeah.
but because like it's all about killing in like Warhammer, which is an awesome feeling to watch
Yeah.
your models just wipe away squads or like do something really heroic. Whereas the first time I played Bolt Action, I was like, I'm gonna shoot those guys, and I was like, cool, they take one pin. And I was
Yeah.
like,
What's
oh,
that then?
oh, okay. Like I didn't kill anyone. They're like,
Yeah.
no, pins are good though.
Yeah.
And you understand how it all works. You're like, oh, okay. So it's not that it's bad or better. It's just
yeah,
that
it's just different. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
different, and it's a different view on games, and they've all got their different takes. And I've got to be brutally honest, a lot of the games out there, and even the ones that I haven't yet had the chance to play, they are all good in their own way.
Yeah.
That's why they exist.
There is a genius within simplicity, and if something is easy for you to learn and hard to master, it has been actually designed very well, and there's been a lot of thought into that actually happening.
Yeah.
So I think that, when it comes to the fact that, your opposing force can't have a unit that you just possibly can't have.
Yep.
It gives opportunity for really equal standing, regardless of list type.
Yeah.
There's obvious benefits and negatives to everything that we've discussed, and they can really help on the table, but it doesn't dictate it before you get there.
No, and I think there's enough. We obviously were on a tangent, bear with us, but I think there's enough of that simplicity balanced with unpredictability. So you've got, everyone gets frustrated by Rookie Pilot, but how frustrating would it be, if your artillery strikes and your air strikes for 100 points were bang on every single time, right?
Yeah.
Like it would be 100 points that you pretty much go, well, I know it's going to come in, I know it's going to happen, so I'll always take one.
Yeah.
As opposed to where we are at the moment, where you've got people like myself, where I'm a bit dedicated, where I will generally, in certain types of my forces, because of the way I've built them, I will always have an observer to support the army, because I've built the army to function that way. Or I will actually not use one, because I've deliberately built the army to go, I'm not going to be engaging in that space. So my Japanese don't have one, but my US do.
And there's mentalities to that, not even within the sense that, the US have 2 airstrikes, so you've got more opportunities for air to come in. But there are players out there that I know that just will not take the chance that it has, and they go that 100 points or whatever it is, depending on the veterancy and whatever else. They say it's not worth it because I can guarantee points elsewhere, and those can do work.
Yep.
Although the airstrike is strong.
Yeah. It is. Yeah, it is. And I think for me, and I enjoy lots of different games and board games and all sorts of other stuff. And I've been involved in role-playing games where it's balanced or not balanced or whatever I choose it to be as a DM. But the reality is that for me, Bolt Action sits at a really nice place. Where it's easy to absorb and it's simple enough that you can still get some flexibility out of it and make it complicated if you need to, and the system doesn't break, and that's probably the key part. But anyway, we might just jump back to list building stuff. So as the purpose of this podcast, it doesn't have to happen. So that will actually round off our initial beginning of list building, right? So that this is now your basics. So you know what your purpose of the list is, you know what that looks like, you know why you're creating a list, you know what parameters you're going to be using, you understand what the core requirement is, which is partly determined by your selector, but realistically it's someone to lead and then 2 units to support, and then after that it's really up to you, and there's going to be a piece on that.
You're not going to stop there, are you? You've got more for us.
Of course not, no.
This is a deep dive.
Yeah, so our next, when we get the chance to talk about this the next time for the list building, we actually get to the trickier part. So this is then talking about the unit selection specifically. So we're going to get into some actual unit types and some unit breakdowns. I'm going to reintroduce or introduce, depending if you're new to the concept, the idea of some very quick, what's known as math hammer, or what I know as math hammer. And in reality, for how that actually works in practice, it's just math, it's just a bit of mental math. But it's being aware of some key things using that mental math when looking at a unit to evaluate whether that unit is conceivably good or not for its points, but also for its effect overall on the list. And then we're going to talk about play testing, why you should play test a list, and the reasons that you want to be doing that to learn from play testing a list. It's not going to happen every time, but if you design a list and you go, that right there is what I'm going to work with, it's what I'm going to try hard to have a good win ratio with, you've got to play test it. Because if you just pick a bunch of random stuff together, even as an experienced player, it doesn't always work. And then it's, you have to learn from your adjustments. So there's an adjustment and an iteration phase where your knowledge of how the game plays gets better the more you play. The knowledge of how your list works and what it can accomplish and what it can't accomplish gets better the more that you play. But you have to actually put in that time to get it sorted out. That normally happens more so for events and tournaments than anything else. But there's no reason that you can't do it for a generic list. For my initial list that I started, it was a Siberian regular Soviet squad, 2 guard squads, a tank rider squad, a T-34-85 with an artillery piece, commissar, a officer, sniper, anti-tank team, I think was what I started with. So that was about 12 units-ish in that space. I think it was just on or just over 1,000 points depending on the equipment options. And I played that solely for about a year and a half. It was a balanced list, and I played that solely, no changes to configuration, no changes to the weapon options, to learn how I could get the most out of those units. I play tested it. Now, 12 months might have been excessive. I played a lot of games in that 12 months using that list. But I know now, whenever I pick up that list, whenever I pick those units out,
what to expect.
And it doesn't matter what faction now that I pick those units up out of, I know what I can do with those units. I know what I can do with similar units. And so that counts for quite a lot.
Yeah, well that's going to be really exciting to get into, but one thing I'll just end off here on the list building itself, don't just try it once and then just throw it away.
Yeah.
You need to really just try it a few times. It's very easy to get in this mindset of, oh, this didn't work, I need to adjust this right away and change things. You need to have a couple of matches to see where it's going to go. And in the sense of that, back to you're talking about your first list. My first list when we came back to V2 was just 30-man box of German Grenadiers and a Panther.
Hey, that's me.
I've got a humor in there as well.
Yeah, humor as well.
Yeah, but my mentality was I want to get into this game as quick as I can. I want to spend the least amount of money. So that's
your mentality for every game, though.
It is.
That's a different podcast episode.
I'll probably put in a little bit more effort into Bolt these days. But I won some games. I lost some games in that matchup. So there's not a wrong way to sort of build something. It's really good to look into this and try and discover what's going to work for you. But we'll leave it there. So thanks for checking in. My name is Jacob.
I'm Tyler.
And I'm Daniel.
So this is the Historical Miniature Gamers Podcast. Thanks for listening to us. Let us know in the comments if you enjoyed this episode about list building. Give us any suggestions that you would like for us to cover, whether that be a game system, some more tactics, event coverage, anything that you would like. Please let us know and we'll try and accommodate.
Or get us on email at historicalminiaturegamers@gmail.com. We'll read your emails out on the podcast, and
if they're appropriate.
And please like and share the video. Try and support us. Get on top of Facebook. Follow us on Western Tabletop, Historical Miniature Gamers. We're both the same sort of
the same group.
So find us on there. If you like listening to us but maybe can't watch a video all the time, we are a podcast. So we are also on iTunes, Google Podcasts and Spotify. So please like us there. Give us 5-star rating on iTunes. That would be awesome. Thanks for checking in.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.